Well, look, thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this great event. It's always an absolute delight to speak at CEDA events. And of course, the timing is impeccable, as always, coinciding as it is with the first major review of competition policy in over 20 years, which Ian is heading and Sue over there is involved in as well. I tend to think of competition as a bit like defence. It sort of requires eternal vigilance because there's always a very strong vested interest in trying to reduce competition, because it's one of those things that benefits the many but causes harm to the few, and they fight like hell. Now, Australia's low productivity calls for Australia to create national champions or to allow industries to consolidate in response to low investment returns, the privatisation of assets in ways that hinder competition in an attempt to maximise one-off gains, all suggest to us that Australia has lost a fair bit of its pro-competition culture. So I think clearly we do need Hilmer Mark II, which is what Ian Harper's review was always called by the now government as they were bringing it in, and continues to be called. Now, effective competition policy involves three things. Firstly, opening up new sectors to competition. Secondly, having strong competition laws, because if competition laws are too weak, that leads to efficiency and welfare losses. And thirdly, we need institutions that continually foster competition and maintain the commitment to reform. Now, I'm going to talk about all three of those today reasonably briefly, but I'm going to begin by just talking a bit about our declining competition culture. Now, I see 5 examples of that. The first is really in the way we've done public policy in the past, and here I'm going to draw on an article that Fred Hilmer wrote probably a couple of years ago now. Fred reflected on the productivity growth that had followed his review, and he made a distinction between enablers and incentives. He said that to become more productive, firms need enablers such as infrastructure, education, skills, R&D. But enablers aren't enough. Just because individual firms can increase productivity does not mean they will. For this, they need incentives, particularly those provided through competition. And Fred argued that in the past decade or so, Australian public policy has become much more focused on enablers like building things and much less on incentives. And I very much agree with Fred's observation. But today I want to focus on some other signs of that malaise. My second example is where we're seeing a return to calls for national champions in Australia. It's of course terrific when companies outcompete their rivals and take on the world. The concern is, though, when they call for restrictions on competition at home so they can compete better on the world stage. To me, the argument's a contradiction. If you can't beat your rivals at home, how can you hope to do so overseas? Now, I first encountered this argument when Robert Holmes à Court sought to take over BHP in the late 1980s. BHP asked the government to stop the bid and protect BHP as a national champion. The government refused. In many ways, I think that was a bit of a turning point for BHP. Of course, it now is a national champion under its own steam. Third, we're seeing more calls for weaker merger laws to allow companies to consolidate in response to low investment returns. Some in business that I meet are incredulous that the ACCC would not wave through a merger when investment returns are low, so that the merger parties can create, in their terms, a more rational market with more sensible, and they mean higher pricing. But competition is and is meant to be a disruptive process. Allowing mergers that can reduce competition or sustainably increase entry barriers really does come at quite a considerable cost to the rest of us. Fourth, and perhaps my largest concern at the moment, is the seemingly prevailing approach to privatisation. I see a large plus and a large minus. The plus is that governments are increasingly adopting the right approach to the question of when to privatise. In essence, I think commercial operations should be run by the private sector unless there's a public policy reason for the government to hang on to it, and unless that's the only way in which you can meet that public policy objective. Otherwise, sell them. That does seem to be the prevailing mood, and that's good. Where governments are increasingly failing is in how to privatise. They're privatising, I think, increasingly in ways that limit competition in order to maximise the sale proceeds, and this is very much the wrong way to do it. Such an approach increases the one-off sale proceeds by effectively taxing future generations and Australia's future competitiveness. Now, in the late 80s and early 90s, the Commonwealth Bank and Qantas were privatised to increase efficiency. Indeed, Qantas was privatised into a largely open skies environment. That wouldn't have happened if you were trying to maximise the proceeds. I remember having heated debates when Victoria was privatising its electricity generation. Didn't I realise, I was asked, that Victoria would see much higher sale proceeds if it sold its generation to one or two companies? There were people who just didn't get the point that the government was privatising to improve efficiency, not to maximise its sale proceeds. The Victorian government understood this completely and privatised a large number of individual units, which I think still serves them well today. Now, worryingly, this approach is not being followed increasingly today. For example, electricity companies have a strong commercial incentive to have all players vertically integrated. Trading wholesale electricity through the spot market is a competitive process with actually quite low barriers to entry. If electricity retailers can fully vertically integrate and tie up most of the generation, then they can create a stable oligopoly with high entry barriers. And we've seen that in New Zealand, we've seen that in the UK, to the detriment of consumers. These issues go to the heart of the ACCC's report to the Australian Competition Tribunal in its consideration of AGL's proposed acquisition of Macquarie Generation. The ACCC formed the view that the acquisition would result in a substantial lessening of competition when compared with a future in which the state either held onto the assets or sold to other purchasers. In its report to the tribunal, the ACCC said, as a result of this lessening of competition, the proposed acquisition is likely to mean that consumers will pay more for electricity and be offered less choice. Of course, it's up to the tribunal to decide whether the benefits from the transaction outweigh these detriments, and I understand they'll deliver their decision this week. And that's the test for merger authorisation. Some governments are also privatising ports without appropriate access regimes or controls on pricing. We shouldn't be surprised then when buyers pay a high price to acquire monopoly power with the expectation they'll be able to recoup that expenditure through higher prices. Now, we're becoming aware of an increasing concern amongst businesses that use these ports that they're going to be paying well into the future. My final illustration is in relation to the drive to reduce red tape. Now, that, of course, is a necessary spring clean as we review regulations that seemed a good idea at the time. Many owners of monopoly assets, however, including vertically integrated owners, are utilising sensible general red tape reduction statements to argue for reduced curbs on their market power. And we would simply say that red tape reduction needs to be about removing barriers to competition, not reinforcing companies' monopoly power. Our competition culture in future years is going to be increasingly tested by the growth of new technology. One example we all would have read of recently, I think, is the protests in Europe by taxi drivers worried that the new mobile apps, such as that operated by technology firm Uber Technologies, were damaging their businesses. Similar issues are emerging here. Competition regulators around the world have expressed concern at measures that might be taken to ban or deter the entry of such firms. So technology is going to provide us with increasing tests to our competition culture. Just let me turn briefly to competition and other incentives to boost efficiency. I certainly always find it irritating when people say that Australia has picked all the low-hanging micro-reform fruit. In my view, we haven't, and there's never only one crop of fruit anyway. Let me provide just two examples of what could be tackled. A major area of unfinished business from the Hilmer reforms related to our land transport infrastructure. Currently, road user charges provide very poor road usage signals. These charges reflect past expenditure and so cannot directly fund future roads. And of course, the user charge revenue doesn't go to those who build the roads. It's more seen as a revenue-raising measure. There's much to do in that area. Secondly, given the importance of shipping to the Australian economy, the ACCC sees two particular areas of reform that could lead to productivity gains. Firstly, Part 10 of the CCA provides cartel immunity to registered shipping lines to enable them to cooperate with each other. And for a country such as Australia, that is now, I think, rather silly and should be revoked. In addition, in the domestic shipping sector, there's a number of restrictions on competition protecting domestic shipping against international shipping, and those should be removed as well. In our submission to Ian's review, we'll be suggesting a whole range of other areas for micro-reform. Turning to our competition laws, they really do need to strike a balance between promoting healthy rivalry and also deterring anti-competitive conduct. If they're not strong enough, we all suffer. Let me just give two examples of where I think those laws could be improved. First, we think there's a significant gap with the misuse of market power laws. And the law is deficient in two respects. First, it doesn't have an effects test, it's just a purpose test. And second is the way in which the take advantage limb of the test is currently being applied. Now, I've got a written speech which goes into those arguments. I won't take you through them now, given the time. But there's two serious impediments to making misuse of market power work. We come across many examples of behaviour that we think is problematic in the spirit of our competition laws, and we can't act because of the deficiencies in the misuse of market power laws, and I think we all suffer as a result. The second area is where we have laws that deal with disclosures of pricing and other information between competitors, which is referred to internationally as facilitating practices. These practices facilitate cartel-like outcomes, but they don't meet the formal criteria of a cartel. But they are just as harmful. Current legislation limits price signalling laws to just the banking sector. We would like those laws extended to the entire economy. We don't see why they should just be limited to one sector of the economy. And if they were extended, our laws would be much more in keeping with overseas regimes. Let me just talk about now some of the processes and institutions behind that can drive future competition reform. I personally see one of the key successes of Australia's competition policy since Hilmer as being the integration of competition enforcement, consumer protection and utility regulation. The three arms of what we at the ACCC do all have a common purpose, which is making markets work as they should. All three go to that one objective. And with all three being together, you get economies of scale, you get enormous synergies, you don't get issues falling between the cracks, and you don't get more than one institution chasing the same matter. To give an example of things that could fall through the cracks, we recently instituted proceedings against Coles in relation to their treatment of suppliers. We alleged unconscionable conduct. It's before the court, so I won't say too much about it, except that our concern was over the potential for suppliers to become less able to plan and less able to innovate in the market, with resulting reduced economic efficiency. And it's not clear to me that that aspect of the consumer law would be used if it was a standalone consumer agency. I'm not sure their focus would be on such a business issue. Similarly, our focus on credence claims, that is where a product is produced, how it's produced, is all about consumer protection and competition. And most of the complainants we have in relation to these issues are from businesses doing the right thing, complaining about somebody else's cheating. and it's not clear to me, again, if you had standalone competition and consumer, that those issues would get picked up. Look, my final point in terms of improving the institutional framework is to raise the issue of whether the ACCC should have the power to conduct market studies. The International Competition Network, which is the umbrella body for the world's competition agencies, describes market studies by competition regulators as research projects conducted to gain an in-depth understanding of how sectors, markets or market practices are working. The OECD has noted that, along with investigating infringements of the competition law, almost all competition authorities, certainly in developed countries, conduct general sector investigations or these market studies. They do that in the US, the UK, the EC, Korea, Japan, Germany, Italy, I could go on. But we don't do them here. One benefit of such studies is that they allow the competition authority to bring its information gathering powers to bear to assess the functioning of the market as a whole, rather than the conduct of particular firms in it. The result of these studies can be enforcement action by us. They can be recommendations to government. They can simply shine a light on a problem, or in many ways, more importantly, they can explain to the public why there's no problem at all. Our inability to do this puts us out of step with overseas regulators. Now, parties often bring concerns to us which we can't act on unless we can actually see a breach of the Act. If we had the market studies power, it would allow us to respond to these general concerns where people aren't sure what the problem is, but they think there's a problem. So look, let me conclude by saying that over 20 years ago, business, government and people generally got behind a pro-competition culture. Australia benefited enormously from that. Our GDP went up by 5 percentage points. We're all a lot better off for that bit of reform. And I'm very confident the Harper Review can replicate this success. There will, of course, be challenges. The reforms that the Hilmer Review tackled were largely related to government-owned businesses, and those government-owned businesses weren't able to speak up much in defence of their privileged position. This time round, there'll be a lot more opposition. So it'll be really important that everybody contributing to this debate takes a national rather than sector perspective. Thanks very much.